switch of topic after a rather long series on Bakfla therapy. I'm sure all of us have been exposed to NLP in some manner or the other.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So, any perceptions, any thoughts about it to begin with?
It's very good. It's actually, we can say it's a branch of psychology only. But Richard Bandler and Grinder, they have added science into it.
Yeah.
And so any, even common people can use it
Yeah.
without the understanding of much of a psychology.
Absolutely. And as you go along, it tends to be very process based also, so it can be simplified to a great degree, although it's operates at a very subtle level.
Yeah.
Any other perceptions about it? Because when it comes to the term NLP, I've heard all kinds of things from people, ranging from extremely positive to extremely negative. So yeah, depends on how it's used. But yeah.
You don't. Earlier thinking process was that change can take long time to bring certain change.
Yes.
And by applying this science or the principles, you can create that change much faster.
Yes. And yes, changes through NLP can be extremely quick. Challenge here is it always helps to have somebody who's willing to consciously operate with that shift, because a lot of the resistance here comes from the person who's trying to make that shift, because then there's a fight between the conscious and the unconscious, and in that process sometimes the change gets a loss. But yeah, extremely powerful if it's used properly. So the reason for the choice of the reason for the choice of this particular topic was, one, yes, it has enough material, enough tools and techniques which are powerful enough and which can be continued enough in a series, and it's something that each of us in some way or the other can directly apply to aspects of our own life. So you don't need to be ill in any way whatsoever to be able to use NLP. A perfectly healthy person can also use it.
Sometimes unknowingly also we use it,
Yes.
but we don't know the science behind it.
Oh yes. And a lot of times we use it in dangerous
Correct,
ways.
correct.
Yeah, unknowingly. True. So, just as a backgrounder for those of us who are not familiar with it, it stands for Neuro-linguistic Programming, and therefore we're talking about dealing with the programming, the wiring of our brain, which has largely been a result of the conditioning that we've been brought up with, the environment, our beliefs, our values. And to some degree, biology does play a role here. So, today's agenda is primarily an introductory aspect of NLP, and then along the series we'll look at specific what are termed as patterns or tools or techniques to
So you are going to take series.
Yes, yeah, because there's so many
Correct,
tools
correct.
here and each of them is extremely powerful. So I'd like to deal with each tool.
That will be better.
Yeah. So today is a very introductory talk about it, and yes, we will look at one very core primary tool which can be used very readily by all of us. So NLP, as he said, was not so much founded as much as discovered by Richard Bandler and John Grinder. Their quest at that point was not so much to discover anything like NLP, but primarily to understand how does excellence happen and can excellence be replicated or modeled, as the term that was used by them. Right? So they went about their research, and very academic research when they began, was primarily to look at what they termed as geniuses in various fields. So it could be a genius musician, to a genius speaker, to a healer, to all kinds of people who are geniuses in their respective fields. And the quest was to understand what is the wiring of their brains that makes them geniuses, given that you cannot really look into their brains and actually scan them. How is it that we can model their behavior simply by looking at them externally? That was primarily the quest. So I'm also going to be approaching this entire series from the perspective of modeling excellence. Right? So, and excellence could be in any area. It could be somebody cooking, somebody singing, somebody healing, absolutely any area. So, that being the premise, modeling excellence being the premise, there are several tools and techniques which have evolved over the years. So, there is the traditional NLP, and then there is what is called the new code NLP. So, that there has been a lot of, and there continues to be a lot of work in terms of tools developed here. So, today what I'd like us to talk about is a very primary tool, which is pacing and leading. And why pacing and leading? Is for the purpose of learning. I mean, there is a tool, but why do we use it? Is for the purpose of learning. Right? So, now pacing is something that we do consciously, or sometimes, a lot of times unconsciously, day in and day out. What does the term sound like to us? What does pacing mean?
Rhythm.
Rhythm, absolutely. Movement, yeah, pace in that sense, yeah. And yeah, in fact, it's a combination of the two, rhythm, movement. And here you're talking about capturing the rhythm of another and moving along with it. So from the NLP perspective, that's what pacing is about. So why do we use pacing consciously from the NLP angle is to be able to match the person's rhythm and eventually be able to lead and perhaps learn from the person. Right? So pacing happens unconsciously a lot of times. You'll see it all around you. If you look at let's say even a coffee shop where someone's having an intense conversation, if you sit and look at a couple having an intense conversation, you will find that they unconsciously pace each other. So one person's body language becomes very aggressive and you'll find the other person's body language also immediately shifts. Or at home, if you're having a fight with somebody, one person's voice raises, the other person's voice also raises. So we mirror each other, we pace each other unconsciously, very often. Now, the danger with unconscious pacing is, yeah, if you're doing it where the other person has a positive emotion, great, you will also enjoy the positive emotion and feel good about it. Like very often when we hear nice soothing music and we flow with it, we are really listening to it, in a way we are pacing with the music and we benefit from it, we feel good about it. Right? However, if we unconsciously happen to pace something which is uncomfortable, right? So somebody is raising his voice and we raise our voice along with it, then yes, we're getting caught in a trap, because pacing is a very powerful connector and it takes a lot to break that connection. So if let's say I'm in a very if I'm in an intense relationship with you and I happen to pace with you when you're angry, I'm also likely to pick up that anger and start reacting to you, and in that process build up a huge fight, and all this happens unconsciously just because I happen to be mirroring. And that's where, when used positively, it helps a lot in terms of matching the energy of the person and sometimes matching with the intended to shift to a positive state. And therefore pacing by itself is not useful. Pacing needs to lead to leading, and leading can eventually lead to learning. Right? So how do we pace? Now there are multiple ways at which this can operate. So the easiest, if you're observing, if you're in sight of some person, the easiest way to pace is through the breath. Right? So if you're sitting in front of a person and talking to the person, simply try and match the breath of the person. Sounds very simple, but a lot of times it's difficult because we have a certain rhythm, certain pace of our own breathing, and the other person may have a completely different pace. So, of course, if you're doing pacing. Now, the intent of pacing and leading is to build what is termed as unconscious rapport with a person. Conscious rapport is when we are friendly with a person, we smile, we exchange pleasantries and greetings, and that the conscious rapport is established. NLP works through unconscious rapport, right? So here we are not talking of the outward appearance of being pleasant and exchanging greetings, but also rapport with the rhythm of the person. So the rhythm would include how the person feels at that moment in time, what the person thinks. As you pace, and if you're a good pacer, you will also be willing to take on the beliefs of that person for that moment in time, so that you can truly pace. I mean, true pacing would mean that you're not contradicting the person in any form whatsoever. You completely believe that you are this person, you're joining your energies for that moment, for a particular intent, and then you disconnect after a point in time. So the easiest way is to pace by watching the breath of the person. Right? So it works beautifully with all kinds of people, especially children. It's very easy to praise because they're not very conscious of whether you're looking at them or they go about doing their own thing. Even with adults, you can do it in a very subtle way. You don't have to stare into the person and then start pacing. Then that will make it very obvious. But I mean, even with your peripheral vision, so even if I'm looking that side, I can still observe movements around this side, and I can still continue to pace the person. So you certainly don't have to be staring into the person as you pace. But yes, pacing starts with first step, observe, and the second step would be what is termed as micro muscle mirroring. Right? So if you're spacing the breath, for example, first step, simply observe the breath. What is the rhythm of breathing? Is there a gap between two breaths? How fast or how slow is it? Then get into micro muscle mirroring. So observing is just visual, simply observe how the person seems to go about it. Micro muscle mirror is observing to a micro degree. So when a person takes in a breath, each person has their own characteristics. Some people would have a slight jaw movement, somewhere the shoulders go up and down, sometimes there's a movement in the stomach, eye movements might shift sometimes. Right? So look at as micro as possible, look at all the movements that seem to happen with the person, and then after a point in time, maybe after a few seconds or sometimes a couple of minutes, when you're comfortable with the pace of that person's breath, then start replicating that pace, which means when the person takes in a breath, you take in your breath. When the person exhales, you exhale, and so on. Let that continue for a while. Once you're able to match the pace, perhaps you can also try micro muscle mirroring without making it very obvious to the person. So that would mean that you replicate the movements, if any, if there are jaw movements happening, if there are stomach movements happening. Try and replicate that very subtly, as comfortably as possible. Right? Micro muscle movement can also be replicated in terms of body language to some degree. So the first part of pacing is breath. The second part that you can look at is all the visual anchors. So apart from breath, you've got visual, which means if the person is standing or sitting in a particular manner, then replicate that movement without making it look like you're imitating or copying the person. So let's say if somebody is sitting cross-legged, maybe in the course of the conversation, casually also try and mirror and sit cross-legged without making it too much of a copy. Right? So match the visual anchor of that particular person. So if the person happens to be standing in a particular way, try and replicate that stance in terms of posture, in terms of the gap between the feet and all of that. Try and match as much as possible. You can also pace in terms of tone. Right? There is also an auditory anchor. So if the person happens to have a certain rate of speech, right? Some people speak slow, some people speak fast. So if you're talking with that person, try and match that rate of speech. Try and match the pitch and the volume of the person initially to pace with. Right? So you have the visual, you have this auditory, you can also have any kind of a kinesthetic anchor. So kinesthetic is one part is body language. The other kinesthetic anchors are sometimes it's very obvious that the person happens to feel very warm or very cold. See if you're able to have the same feelings, if you're able to anchor that part as well. So use all the sensory organs primarily to see if you're able to pace at all levels. If not, pacing the breath is just fine. Right? Sometimes if you're trying to pace somebody over the phone, then breath and tone can work pretty well. If you're face to face with the person, you have an opportunity to work with all of it. Now, first step of pacing is simply observe, then start micromuscle mirroring in terms of breath and in terms of all of these factors as well, as much as possible. Once you're confident that you're completely pacing with the person, which means you're completely in sync in terms of the breath of the person, and also, if possible, in all the other three areas, then you can try leading. Now, what would leading mean?
Increasing this, or we want that person to complete this.
Yes. Yeah. So, let's say you have let's say you call up a bank executive or somebody. Sometimes you find these call center people talking in their own slow pace with their script, regardless of whether you're in a hurry or not, right? And it gets irritating. Now, if that person happens to be in that slow rhythmic pace and you happen to be hurrying and in a high pitch and high volume talking over the phone, somewhere there is a mismatch, and it's unlikely that you'll possibly get work done in that process. So it helps to start leading the person, not learning here, but leading. So start leading the person, which would mean first step is you pace. So you observe what is their rate of speech, what is their breath, and actually pace with it, which means you slow down your pace, you slow down your breath and match their rhythm for a minute or so, and then slowly start leading them, which means once you realize you're in unconscious rapport, you're in sync, then start leading, which means you pick up your pace, you pick up your rate of speech, right? And then you will slowly realize that because you're in unconscious rapport, the person will also start mirroring you automatically without realizing it, because the rapport here is not conscious but unconscious, right? So pacing needs to happen to a degree where you know you're in unconscious rapport. Once you are sure unconscious rapport is established, then you start leading. So one way to experiment is, if you're sitting in a restaurant or a coffee shop, try and pace somebody who's maybe in the next table or so without making it very obvious. So through your peripheral vision you can observe and start pacing the person. Once you're sure you're in rapport, try leading. Now leading could be a simple experiment of you matching the body language of the person for a while, and then you slowly shift your body language. So let's say if you're both sitting with your legs crossed, after a while slowly uncross your legs, change your posture. If you were sitting back, then sit straight up. And you will realize that within a few seconds or so, that person will shift his or her stance. Now, it may not be replicated visually, but you will realize that the person has picked up your energy because there is unconscious rapport established, and somewhere there is a shift of movement. Similarly, works beautifully over the tone if you're trying to calm somebody down. If someone's extremely anxious or agitated over the phone and calling you, match their pace for a while, which means match their rate of speech, match their agitation, but consciously. The point is not for you to get agitated. The point is to match the pace so that once you're in sync, you get to calm them down. So after you've paced them for a while, suddenly you drop your tone, you introduce calmness in your voice, and you will see that they invariably calm down. Usually a person gets agitated if that person's extremely anxious and you're being this picture of calm and serenity, and that's not what they want to hear at that moment in time. So actually a lot of pacing, and the pacing exercise is primarily about empathy through unconscious rapport. So what we're trying to do through pacing is feel like how the other person feels, to don their belief systems, to don their kinesthetic feeling, to don their vocals at that moment in time. Replicate as much as possible. Okay? And it's important to feel and completely take in the other person's identity at that moment in time. So pacing may work, but only partially if you're pacing at one level, but at the same time judging the other person for saying, I don't agree with this guy and I don't think he thinks in the right way. If there's judgment behind it, then at some level the pacing is going to break. For that moment in time, you need to completely adorn that person's belief. Just for that moment, because what you're trying to do is completely understand that other person and then eventually lead to a good positive state. And the only intent behind leading after pacing is to move from a negative state to a positive state. It's not for selling, it's not for manipulating the other person in any way whatsoever. But works beautifully if you want to heal relationships, you want to calm a person down, you want to make somebody feel better. It's a very simple, lovely tool and just takes a couple of minutes. Yes, it will take some effort to practice pacing, so any kind of a public place is always a good idea. Local trains work beautifully. Yeah, a lot of time, especially if you're able to pace with somebody who's having a fight in the train, pace with them and then immediately calm yourself down, you will find that fight dissipating.
Immediately sit.
Yeah, you will immediately find that. I've experimented that a lot in public places, in malls and coffee shops and all kinds of places. Works beautifully if you want to shift another person's state to a better state. But yes, use it responsibly. It's a powerful tool, and sometimes you might end up agitating a person who was perfectly calm, and that's really not the point of doing this. So you can always bring the person to a better state through pacing and leading. So leading is mainly shifting your stance. So shift your state. So your state could be in terms of thought, emotion, more comfortable body language, more comfortable posture. Whatever you think would make the other person feel better in that moment, that is where you would lead. Right? So that's pacing and leading. Now, so far, what can we gain from this process? We've not touched learning yet, but what do we gain from this so far?
Mainly to increase your relationship by building a rapport, so that one is the desired outcome you want,
Yes.
in a good way,
Yes.
not a negative way,
Yeah.
and to improve the relationship with the other person.
Yeah. Works very well if you want to work on relationships through it, and unconsciously the kind of empathy that it generates is beautiful. When I studied NLP and I thought of pacing, I didn't really think of empathy really. But the more you practice it, you realize there's so much of connect and so much of understanding that generates through pacing. It's beautiful, and you sometimes end up understanding a person who you thought was diametrically opposite of you in terms of viewpoints or attitudes, and there's absolutely a beautiful change in relationships through pacing and eventually leading certainly to a better state.
And even for if you want to resolve any conflict, so this is also
Yes, it immediately dissipates the situation. At least it creates room for dialogue. So works very well there.
And in business relation, your negotiations.
Yeah. Any kind of a negotiating thing, a meeting room situation where you want everyone to be in a good mood to be able to discuss something. works very well. So in terms of practicing this, I would suggest initially start pacing with individuals, one person at a time, right? And after that, you will find that you will be able to pace with an entire group as well. For those of you who deal with, let's say, if you're teaching or you're training or dealing with more than one person, you will be able to eventually pace with the group as a whole. Well, once you're able to sense the energy when you walk into a room and you realize, okay, people are feeling a little mellow or people are feeling extremely high energy, match that pace and then bring them to a pace which is appropriate for that particular situation. Because once people start pacing together, there is so much more receptivity, so much more conversation that the relationship or the meeting becomes very fruitful. So it can be used at all levels. If you want to get children to calm down, study, eat, pacing works beautifully. Pace with them for a while. So if they're feeling freakish or that they want to play or they want to be, they're hyperactive, match it for a while, match their tone, match the body language, try run around with them for a minute or so, and after that slowly pace with them and calm them down. And then if you keep that pace up, which means you keep that unconscious rapport built, you sync the breath and continue to do it, after a while they'll mirror whatever you're doing. So then if you sit down and start eating, they will invariably come and sit and start doing the same thing without being told. Works very well if you want to put children to sleep. I mean, that's one thing I use it for. So if they don't feel sleepy, pace with them for a while, play with them for a while, build them in rapport, and then after a while all you need to do is you go to sleep. They'll mirror you. Because somewhere there is so much of rapport that the consciousness starts matching, and then they'll mirror whatever you're trying to do. So pacing and leading by itself is a very powerful tool. But what I'd like us to also explore is the aspect of learning through it. Now, how do you think that works? Learning in what context?
Learning maybe in terms of understanding other person's belief or other person's way of looking towards that particular issue.
Okay, so again empathy, yeah.
How to bond with that person.
Yeah.
Bonding.
Yes. So yeah, pacing and leading by itself can establish that bond, that sense of empathy, that understanding of different perspective. That can be done by these two, let's say, levels themselves. By learning, I'm talking in terms of...
I think it has a little deeper meaning. It's trying to understand why is it that person is going on this line. And it is just something like reading the person's mind.
Yeah. Sometimes yes, almost reading it in a conscious way, sometimes unconsciously doing that. Now here, my agenda in terms of learning is where, as I said earlier, if you want to model somebody, if you want to model, getting to know and trying to sometimes be the person as well, not just leaving it at knowing. So when I say learning, for example, if I want to model, let's say a great public speaker, let's say I have a fear of public speaking and I want to be like this particular role model that I have, right? Now pacing and leading can be used to actually model that person and learn from that person. Now this can, of course it works most powerfully if you're in physical, if it's the same physical environment, so if the person happens to be on a stage and you're in the auditorium, works most beautifully there. But it also works very well even if you happen to watch a person's video. The person playing a guitar or painting or speaking or whatever is in an act that can be visually seen. If you're able to model that, works really beautifully. So what you can, if you're doing it in person, yes, you do the same pacing and leading process. Now, of course, you don't lead, you open yourself to be led. Okay? So let's say if I want to talk like how somebody else talks, right? I start pacing with the person And after a point in time, I simply start micro muscle mirroring. Right? So I establish unconscious rapport if I'm in the same room as the person, and I simply start micro muscle mirroring. Now I may not copy it very openly if the person happens to be in front, but at least make that effort to ensure that my muscles move, if not the entire limb. Right? And after a point in time, you build so much of rapport that the next time you get up and start doing that activity, you will incorporate that person's skill or talent in one sense. Not so much
Trying to
mimicking.
be like that person. In other words, you're saying trying to be like that person.
Trying to be like that person. Not so much mirroring, but what you're doing is you're training the body to actually adopt the same micro muscle movement. So what does it take for a fluent speaker to be there and be confident and have a certain tone of voice, right? So all you're doing is training the body to be like that person, not so much mimicking in the copying sense of the term. Yeah, but you're literally wearing that person's shoes, and then the next time you expose yourself to that situation or that opportunity, you will, because you've already trained your muscles to do what he or she does, you will pick up that confidence, you will pick up that tone and that strength to deliver like that person.
Reading other person's mind.
Yes, and here you may not even consciously read the mind.
Learning other person's mind.
Yes, learning their talents. Yeah, which is, in fact, that's where it brings us back to the whole purpose why they discovered NLP. It was purely to model excellence. That was the core purpose, and that's where I think beyond pacing and leading, that learning is also something we should not miss out on. So wherever is it that you find excellence, it could be somebody cooking beautifully in your house. Right? All you need to do is be in the same room as them and watch and simply pace and let yourself be led. Right? So be with the person, be in unconscious rapport, match the pace, match the body language, match the breath, all of that, and simply just be around with that person, and the next time you try and do that activity, you will do it almost as well as them. May not be as well, but almost as well.
You can ask, once you build the rapport,
Oh yes, then that rapport will also lead to conscious rapport, so you can always ask also about it.
how he does or
Yes,
what he does.
yeah. It works beautifully where there is not so much where there's a knowledge element involved, but where there is a skill involved. You can pace and lead to learn extremely easily. If let's say if you're a singer and you want to try and pace with even Lata Mangeshkar's video, and I've seen a lot of singers doing that. They actually pace with the video, and beyond a point in time, they start developing those nuances in their voice which did not exist earlier. Because somewhere when you're micro muscle mirroring, you're activating muscles, you're activating tissues in the body which were not consciously used by you earlier. Now, because you're in unconscious rapport with another person, and because that person happens to use it in a certain way, you start picking it up and it starts working for you. Right? So can be used for any visible kind of a skill. If someone's painting, someone is dancing in a particular way, or any kind of a skill that's visible. We've had research of people who've, there's a couple of people that I work with have modeled healers. Okay, there's apparently, I forget the name of the tribe, but there's this entire village in Nagaland where pretty much everybody who lives there is a touch healer. So they don't know how it works. Their theory is that the plants around us heal, we are just placing our hands. That's how they believe. They don't really have a system or a documented thing, but they've done beautiful work in terms of healing. Anybody who comes to that village, they simply place their hands and that's it, they're healed. Right? So these guys actually tried modeling those people. Now, of course, if you're truly modeling, it will mean you pace completely non-judgmentally, which means for that moment that you're modeling that person, you take on that person's beliefs, you take on that person's everything. So this person who happened to be pacing them was a very rational, scientific, city guy, right? So he had his own belief systems, and these people came in with that thing that we don't heal, plants around us heal. Now initially his belief was that obviously these guys have something in them which heals, but then for that moment in time when he was modeling them, he ensured that he's also donning that belief and saying, okay, plants around us heal, because that's the skill that's what their thought process is. So when you're pacing, try and pace with as much as you can, including belief system, including values, apart from all the physical aspect of pacing. And beyond a point in time, this guy actually started healing. And in fact, now he also dabbles in touch healing. It's not something that he does for a living, but then he has found that people who've come to him with aches and pains and things like that have healed because of his touch, because he's able to use that to connect, that rapport. So learning can happen in any kind of a skill or a talent that you want. So you want to learn to negotiate like somebody, you want to learn to talk like someone, or meditate like someone, or anything, it can be
And by
done
changing
beautifully.
body language, immediately there is a change in mental state. Also.
Absolutely, yeah. Body language immediately shifts. I mean, there's literally a chemical shift in the brain, and therefore a lot of things, including your attitude, shift with the shift of body language.
That is why I think some of the trainers and all, they, I am the best, like that they do.
Yeah.
But immediately you change it. So
Yeah.
those
It makes you
hormones
feel better.
Feel
If
better.
I'm standing like this and beyond a point, I'm going to feel very low and very non-energetic, right? So it does make a lot of difference. But yes, beyond, the invitation here is look beyond just the body language. You can use it very powerfully for learning a lot of things. You can model whatever you find around you which you think you would like to be. So there's so many people around us who we admire for so many things, right? So I want to cook like this person, or I want to dance like this one, or I want to sing like this one, whatever, any kind of a skill that you would like to emulate, try and use pacing and leading. Works really beautifully. In terms of skill, yeah, knowledge level, it's a little difficult. But in knowledge, if you're looking at, like with children, if you're able to teach children to pace and lead, and you want them to, let's say, make notes like somebody, or study like one of their friends or so, that again can be modeled. So ask of course they need to be comfortable with each other to be able to do it, but if the child is able to pace somebody who does something in a nice way, let the child be around that person and pace the person while that thing is happening, and then automatically the child picks up. With children, unconscious rapport is much easier than with adults. We come with a lot of judgments in place. So it's important that we drop all that first, get into what is called that know-nothing state, and then start pacing. But even if you're not able to do that initially, the mere idea of pacing properly leads to a lot of results. Yeah?
As you told about children, sometimes you observe the child, he mirror the person who is influencer.
Oh yes, absolutely.
He has
Yeah.
a tone like that,
Yeah.
or even
Completely.
name, called by name also.
Yeah.
The person like
The children pace everything around them. So yeah. So for them for them it's not even a process. We do it as a process because we have our own rhythm. They pace anything that's
even
around
play,
them.
in that play also.
Yeah. So with babies, you'll find that even as they sleep, they're pacing with the environment around them. Something disturbing happens and you'll see that their sleep is disturbed.
That is inborn.
Yeah, because there at that point in time, you're so much in sync with the environment that you're naturally pacing. Now, as we grow up and we start what Carl Jung calls individuating,
We lose.
beyond a point, we don't lose it as much as we start developing a shield around us. That there is a defense mechanism that starts operating. And so somewhere we stop pacing. So for us, therefore, it is more about going back to something that we already are capable of.
Learning means most time as we grow, our learning stops. So that might be somewhere affecting the pacing and learning.
Yeah, which is a matter of continuing where we think we've had
conditioned.
enough, or
Conditioning.
we've got our degrees, and yeah. So we tend to be complacent. Yeah. Kids don't really measure, so for them it's okay. They're open to it all the time.
We cling to our beliefs, we don't want to lose it.
Yeah. Because the more the sense of identity, the more the blocks
That's
around us. So
rigid.
yeah. So it helps to, this process really helps to break that identity and connect, and very importantly open up to resources which are all around us. And I mean, trust me, if you're using this for modeling, there's so many models around us in terms of, let's say a person exercising in a certain way, meditating in a certain way, healing in a certain way. And if you, today the resources are also easily accessible, even if the person's not in front of us, you can go to YouTube and look at videos of anybody that you want to model. So if it's somebody who's exercising in a particular manner, somebody who is, let's say, athletes do a lot of pacing and leading for their role models. They keep watching videos on and ensure that they completely mirror the other person. So they're training their brains to trigger the muscles exactly the way the other person does, and after a point when they actually go on the track, they replicate that movement, and the same muscles start firing. So can be done for anything physical, anything skill related. With knowledge related, yeah, you'll not import the knowledge as much as you'll import the attitude to get that knowledge. Yeah. So it's more like installing the software, installing the right hardware. The software will still need to come in. Right? So that's one of the basics of NLP, works with the concept of unconscious rapport. Unconscious rapport continues into any other tool or technique that you would use in NLP. So my attempt in this series would be use each talk to look at a particular, what are termed as patterns in NLP, which can be used for healing, for bringing about shifts, for various kinds of purposes, also for protecting oneself, shielding oneself. There are various beautiful patterns that are available, so I'll attempt to uncover those as we go along. But yeah, for now this by itself is a very, very powerful tool. I think most of us who've practiced NLP in some form or the other always keep going back to.
Unconsciously, I think everyone is.
Yeah, unconsciously, God has given that gift to us.
And unconsciously we're pacing all the time. Now the tool is to use it consciously.
Yeah, that is it.
Because unconsciously we pace in all the wrong ways. I mean, if you look at countries pacing each other, then you have all the wars that are happening around us. One country does this and the other one retaliates, and it's pacing, but not really fruitful pacing. So it can be used very beautifully and very fruitfully. So that's an opportunity we have. All right, so that's that for today.
Thank you very much.